All right, good morning, everybody. I acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the land on which we meet today. On behalf of the Sustainable Minerals Institute, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. Today's presentation is delivered by Associate Professor Claire Côte on the operational, regional and national benefits from implementing the water accounting framework in the Bowen Basin mining region. Claire was one of the initial developers of the water accounting framework and implemented it with the Anglo-American metallurgical coal operations. Today, she's reflecting on the framework and some of the unexpected benefits it delivered. As usual for the seminars, you will notice that the Q&A button is at the bottom of the screen, and I'd greatly appreciate it if you could put your questions in there. You feel free to do that during the presentation at any stage where if you have a question. And then at the end of the presentation, I will put your questions to Claire, and we'll have a question and answer session. Claire, over to you.
Many thanks, Neville, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to listeners who are calling from overseas. Thank you for listening to us. So yes, indeed, I am talking about the water accounting framework today. This is something SMI has talked about a lot because we're obviously quite proud of this piece of work. But there's a story that hasn't been told is what happened when we implemented it in the Bowen Basin, so in central Queensland, and the benefits that were derived from this. It's a good little story, so I thought it was worth reflecting on the 10 years of work that happened in the region. Everybody can see my screen, I assume, so someone needs to shout if that doesn't work. And I'm trying to go to the next slide, and for some reason, it's not working. All right, I'll provide a bit of background about the framework and the thinking that took place at the time when we developed it. So we are going back at the start of the Centre for Water and the Minerals Industry in 2005, 2006. There were a lot of activities in terms of starting to produce corporate reports. So it was in its infancy, and we saw a huge growth from 2005 to 2010, 2011 in the production of the sustainability reports. So the large companies started producing them, and of course they needed guidance on what to include in those reports. So they needed reporting standards, and the most well-known of these standards is the Global Reporting Initiative. That was really active in trying to drive that transparency and that reporting of environmental, social aspects of corporate activities. But with water, there was really a need to develop new indicators, and particularly some that were suitable for the mining operations. So whatever indicators were part of GRI back at the time in 2005, 2006, 2007, it really wasn't suitable for mining operations. So there was a real need there. And in parallel with this, there was an initiative launched in Australia, the National Water Initiative, that was really focused on improving the availability and quality of water information. So there was a lot of talk as part of the National Water Initiative in improving water-related information. And they actually wanted to establish the discipline of water accounting. So they were saying, we've got all these financial accounts, we have a lot of standards to set up how financial information needs to be reported, but we've got nothing for water. We really need to establish a new discipline, and we'll call it water accounting. An entire book was published based on that to establish that discipline, and SWMI and SMI did provide the chapter for mining. So there is good reference just strictly related to the discipline of water accounting. So to address all these concerns, the Minerals Council of Australia funded that piece of work and contracted SWMI to develop the water accounting framework. And the objectives were very clear and very simple at the time. We do water reporting, we do it once, we do it well, and whatever numbers we produce, we can use to meet every stakeholder's requirements. So whatever report I need to produce, whatever information is to be submitted to various people, it will all come out of the water account. So we only do it once, we do it well. Very specific objectives. The framework itself is very simple. There is actually nothing complicated in it. All it is a system level representation of a mine water balance. So when we say doing that work, we were getting a lot of reports from mining operations. Most of them, a lot of them, have a site water balance model report. So they have a detailed water balance model for the operation, and there's a report that describes it. Those reports are very long, 100 pages, 200 pages long. You can find everything in it except a water balance most of the time. And we trawl through those reports, say, this is insane, there's a lot of information, I just can't find a water balance. I have to get to that page and then that page and figure out this one and put it all together. So really the need was obvious. It needed a high-level water balance. We find out just how much water comes into the system, the reporting entity, usually the mine, basically. And there's a lot of discussion around system boundaries, but that's well established in the guidance. How much water comes on site and from what source and at what quality. That is the biggest difference between mining operations and, say, any other industry. There's a lot of water coming on site that is not necessarily high quality water, not suitable for potable consumption, not suitable even for irrigation. So categorizing water input with quality was a very important aspect of the framework to meet the requirements of the mining sector. How much water comes in, how much water leaves, so the outputs from the system by destination and again by water quality. And of course, the difference between your output and the input is your change in storage. The other characteristics of mining is diversion. So a lot of water-related activities are around diverting non-mine affected water around a mine site. And the framework provides a pathway to report these numbers. It gets a bit complicated, diversion. That's probably the least simple aspect of the framework, but it is critical because it is something that is unique to mining. So nothing complicated, quite straightforward. The big issue, of course, was implementation. So we are talking change management here and convincing a lot of mines, a lot of stakeholders to change their current, what was at the time the current processes to start reporting water differently. So the Minerals Council of Australia spent a lot of time and effort with SWMI and SMI to develop a lot of guidance material, user guides, a lot of templates and a lot of workshops. And they've run a lot of workshops in Australia, but overseas as well. The most recent series, I think, was in 2016, 2017, when the MC actually organised a workshop in many countries throughout an entire year. So there has been an enormous amount of engagement and a lot of stakeholder engagement and a lot of guidance to assist mines and companies with implementing the framework. And I think that's the key to the success of that framework, is the amount, not so much the technical work that was straightforward, but the amount of work that was done to implement it. And the companies have embraced it. The major ones, they went, fine, that's great, let's do it. And it's impressive when you look at the number of mines that had to do the work. The fact that they've achieved this at the scale of an entire company is impressive. So BHP, first one to do it, embrace it from day one and ask all the operations to do it. And they're now in a position to produce a water account for the entire company. Again, because it's a consistent reporting framework, everybody's producing the same numbers, you can add them up. And when you can add them up, you can produce this sort of graphs, which is your water account for the whole company. Rio Tinto did the same thing. There's an interesting story here around graphic design and the approaches they've selected. So different companies have very, very different ways of presenting what is essentially the exact same information. So this is the Rio Tinto 2018 Global Water Count, and same with Glencore, and other companies will have them as well. So they've really embraced it, a lot of changes at mine site level to produce the information, and then someone at corporate office would compile it to produce those reports. So really pleased. It's now an international guideline and it's been really well accepted by industry. So very successful from that perspective. That was just the context, but what I want to talk about today is what happened in the Bowen Basin specifically. So again, there was a lot of communication and engagement, a lot of support from the MCA, and the guidance documents that are that was produced by SMI. A lot of training workshops in New South Wales in particular. The New South Wales Minerals Council of Australia as well embraced it and provided a lot of support to their members. And then each mine went away and did the work to implement it with a lot of guidance from various people. The greatest shift in approach was that system level representation of the mine water system. So that was the greatest shift. It requires a lot of data collection, particularly around rainfall, climate, catchment mapping and drainage mapping. If you're going to quantify the rainfall runoff you capture in the mine water system, you need to have a really good understanding of your catchment and of your drainage pathway. Am I actually capturing that water in storage? So a lot of activities around mapping and drainage mapping in particular. Storage inventories, obviously this is critical in the water balance reporting. So, and some of these mines have a lot of storage, a lot of pits holding water, and that required a new approach with actually going to measure storage inventories. So walking around sites and picking up water levels and compiling all these. So that is a big piece of work, and particularly when it's done monthly. And a bit more metering, you know, identifying where there were gaps in the data, installing meters to get that data. So a lot of activities on site to get better data. The calculation of rainfall and runoff and evaporation, there are methods out there, and then the level of detail will depend on the mines and how much complexity they want to put in. It's not entirely material, so you know, there can be a bit of paralysis analysis when we do this sort of implementation. So simpler is better sometimes, and if a mine is just starting, I would always recommend to start very simple, the simplest formula you have, look at what it looks like and see where improvements are required. Most mines have adopted it. The whole idea around the water accounts is that they would be produced yearly, but a lot of mines end up doing it monthly. A smaller mine, there could be benefit in doing it more often. If you know, not much storage, very sensitive to small changes in flows, you might want to be reconciling your water balance weekly, but it's quite rare. And monthly is actually quite short, particularly if you have a lot of pits and have to get levels throughout your mine. It's actually quite often. So there's a bit of, it will depend on the complexity of the mine sites, the scale. Weekly, monthly, quarterly, that will depend on the mine. Monthly seems to be a good one. So this is what it's going to look like typically for a met coal mine in the Bowen. For open cut, the input, there is input from the water supply scheme. There's water supply in Queensland is Cern Water, and most mines have a contract with Cern Water for high quality water. But a lot of open cut don't actually require that water, so they may or may not import in depending on the circumstances. A bit of groundwater interception from aquifer, not much. Rainfall and runoff obviously is super variable depending on the seasons and depending on whether we have an El Nino and a La Nina. It can be a huge number, it can be a small number, it really depends. There can be other sources. Some mines share water, so some mines will provide mine affected water to another, so you'd be capturing this sort of arrangement in here. And there's a bit of entrainment from the coal itself, and it is variable but roughly 2-5% depending on the mine. Now in terms of the outputs, few losses from dust suppression and other activities. Evaporation, again, highly variable, depend on how much water is in storage, but it is quite large most of the time. Release to the environment really only in the heavy flows, the heavy rain, so that is quite rare, happens every second, third, fourth year, depending on the climate. Product moisture, that was a big eye-opener when we started implementing the framework. It just, operation didn't realise just how much water, in terms of volume, so they knew the percent, but no one actually transformed it into a volume. So that was a big eye-opener when you produce those volumes, of just how much water was exported through the product. And just a few people made comments that not only were we exporting coal, we're exporting quite a lot of water as well. It can be a large volume, and entrainment in tailings. And as we know, mining, that's where most of your water ends up. So that's an open cut. Underground, very, very similar. The main difference with an underground operation and longwall, they will import high quality water. They send it underground for dust suppression. And it needs to be high quality water. The workforce is exposed to it, the people working underground, but the equipment as well tends to have quite expensive equipment. The longwall shearer in particular, you probably don't want to destroy it with saline water. So most underground mines will import high quality water. It's this at around 1 gigalitres per year, and that's what's so good about the framework. We start to get those numbers, and we find that they don't vary that much. It is quite hard to relate to production. There's a lot of other aspects come in, but we know now that a longwall will require roughly 1 gig a year, and that's from compiling all these numbers over the years for lots of different mines. When you look at these, the sum of your inputs and the sum of your outputs, you realize the conversation around water use in mining is problematic, because what would the definition of water use be? Is it the sum of my inputs? Is it the outputs? What is it? A lot of the inputs you actually can't control. So groundwater inception, you can't do much about it. It will be driven by the environment you are extracting coal from. Rainfall and runoff is entirely driven by the climate, so they're hardly water use, so you can't control them. They're just operational issues you deal with. The one you have an influence on is what you import, the high quality water that is imported from the water supply scheme, and that feeds some of those demands. So any work you'll be doing on your demands to reduce them, they should be reflected back onto that input. So I have a strong view that when we talk about water use in mining, really, we should be referring to the input of high quality water from third parties, because everything else is just operational issues. Operational management has nothing to do with water use itself. ICMM is looking at this, should we provide more guidance on what water use should be? And they're talking about losses, so reporting water use as the sum of your losses. I think that is, I don't agree with this. I did provide feedback, quite strong feedback on that topic, mainly because evaporation, again, is controlled by climate. There's not all that much you can do. Release to the environment is hardly a water use. You're just managing a high rainfall season. So you could argue water use, yes, product moisture entrainment could be perceived as water use, but I don't see much value in losing sleep and arguing about water use should be. I think we've got that framework. It gives us all the information we need, and we just stick with it. And just from a corporate reporting perspective, the input of high quality water is the key indicator of how you're managing your water and your demands from the outside environment. And I think that's the number that should attract attention at that very, very high level, and the rest is for mines themselves to manage. Now, so the mines did this, they all produced those numbers, and then they were used to sort out quite a range of issues that happened over the years, particularly after the floods in 2010, 2011. So producing the accounts after the floods was hugely informative, just to find out the magnitude of the volumes of water that were collected during the floods. It was quite high. The legal instrument that is your environmental permit in Queensland is called an environmental authority. It provides conditions related to air, noise and vibration, waste, land, water, but also structures, the structures that are used to store water and tailings. With the water conditions, there are lots of conditions. Water, it's all around not releasing contaminants to the receiving environment, and they include the principles for releasing mine-affected water to the receiving environment in periods of high flows. There's a long history to how those conditions were derived, and they've been really well captured. That history is really well captured in that paper by Daniel Franks and from SMI and Vinay Sharma. So they wrote that paper back after the floods in 2013. And the focus of the paper is on climate change adaptation, but it does provide the whole history of the release conditions. So if you are interested in how those conditions evolve, there's really good reference there. So that's one thing the regulator looks after is, how do we regulate how much water can go back to the environment? but there's also a lot around on regulated structures, what we call regulated structures. So all those water storage structures, and they're mainly pits, all pits that contain water, and there's dams as well that have been built specifically for storing water. The water is saline. There is risk if it's exported where it shouldn't. So not only do they have regulation on the water release, but also on the storage structures to make sure they don't store too much water and they don't put the environment at risk when there's an important wet season. So they control this through imposing freeboard requirements, and they call that freeboard a design storage allowance. So every storage structure needs to provide for freeboard before the wet season. When the regulator started talking about this, and I call them regulator because they tend to change names. At the moment, they're the Department of Environment and Science, but at the time they were called something else. So they provided guidance on how to calculate that freeboard, and they say you need to calculate your DSA for each individual structure. So you're going to look at each of your dam and pit on site, and then you calculate 100% of the rainfall that falls on the catchment of that storage. You assume it goes in storage, that you've got to capture it, and you do not take evaporation into account. So unsurprisingly, when you look at individual structures and you use super conservative assumptions, 100% of rainfall runoff, no evaporation, you end up with very, very high values for the freeboard volume that is required. So companies were looking at this, they were doing the calculations for each of the pits, and then suddenly the capacity of those pits had to double or triple. It was really, really high. And the financial liability because of these numbers was enormous. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars required to upgrade storage capacity on every mine. So obviously it was an engagement process with the regulators at the time. And the key conversation ended up being on that system level representation. So what they're after, the risk they want to manage is the containment of the wet season runoff. And that's controlled by the freeboard of the whole system, not individual structures, because there is infrastructure that links all those pits. And we saw the spaghetti picture from the saltwater balance model right at the start of this presentation. They're all linked. They've got pumps and pipes linking all of them. And over the course of the wet season, it rains, it starts raining, rains again. There's plenty of time to transfer water from one pit to the other if you've got more room, more storage capacity in this other pit. So really the first part of the conversation was around how to calculate the DSA, and the fact that the DSA could be calculated and should be calculated for the entire containment system, not just individual structures. And then we argued, obviously there was a lot of argument around the calculation methods. Because all the mines had water accounts, there were large data sets for calibration and validation of the detailed water balance model. So the argument became, well, why are we imposing super conservative calculation methods when we have those detailed saltwater balance model that we can calibrate and validate, and we should be using them to calculate the DSA? And our regulator agreed to that, but they did impose some fudge factors, your design simulation margin. So, okay, you can use your model, but we still want you to be conservative. So you've got to add a factor of safety to your calculation. But of course, the more data was produced by the accounts, the more we had calibration data, validation data, and the more we could justify to lower that design simulation margin. So in the end, calculating the DSA for the entire containment system produced very, very different results, but also with assumptions much less conservative in terms of rainfall, runoff, evaporation. The DSA values that were calculated like this using the water account data were much, much lower, to the point where hardly any mine had to upgrade any of their storage structures. So we went from hundreds of millions of dollars of liability to nothing, pretty much. Now, it took a few years. It didn't happen quickly. It took 3, 4, 5 years of engagement, producing the data, using the data to run the models. And every year there's slight improvement in DSA calculation. And this is an exercise the mines would do every year. So they would review their DSA value yearly. And what we've seen, it just keeps dropping at a lot of mines, just because of the data that's produced to validate the model. So there were huge financial savings from the water accounting framework was not an expensive piece of work. The MCA paid for it. It wasn't much money at all. Implementing it was hardly, and there was no cost to companies. It was just the guys on mine sites doing the work. So there was no external spending, and generated hundreds of millions of dollars of non-liability. Now, companies will argue that they would have never agreed to the old, the DSA, the super high DSA values. They would have found a way around it. They would have got the lawyers onto it to argue. I think it's better to do it that way, and displaying good commitment to good science and data collection systems. So I think that's just a fantastic outcome. If anyone's interested around understanding more about regulated structures and how you can use the site water balance model to calculate DSA, because there are a lot of requirements around producing very specific reports and data, etc. It has all been captured in the manual that is produced by DES, the manual for assessing consequence categories and hydraulic performance of structures. It's all captured in there. It's a good manual. A lot of engagement to produce that manual, years of work, and a good landing in the end. So after this, the DS did more work on trying to better understand the risk at the scale of the state of Queensland before the wet season. So we talked about how they regulate water. They've got two levers, the release condition lever and the DSA lever on regulated structures. And what they do is before each wet season, they undertake inspections. So they send a compliance team to the mine sites and they look at the water systems. What are your risks before the wet season? And they wanted a tool to better assess the risks so that they could target the right operation. So some operation present no risk, there's probably not much point with them going there. And trying to have a better schedule for the inspections, because of course they can't go to every single mine before the wet season. So they established workshops with industry and saying, what kind of data should we collect to help us establish a risk assessment framework? And then everybody went, you just need the water accounts. That's all you need. And then they were very impressed. They, okay, that's all we need. We'll just ask for that information. So they did. So they issued data collection requests. It was mainly give us your water account so that we understand your water balance and we understand what the risks are for you coming to the next wet season. It was highly supported by industry. So no one, when the regulator asks for more information, usually it's, oh, no, please, another data request. But industry was super happy, highly supported, no extra work, which was the initial objective of the framework, do it once, do it well, and meet all your requirements. So zero extra work for mines, and then DS obtained all the information they needed. So win-win for that one. So they ended up calling it a regional operation water information tool. They sent the information request before the wet season, so August, September. They get the responses very quickly because it's no extra work. There are obviously other questions that are not related to water accounting around maintenance program and site roles and responsibilities, but it's not too demanding. And then they compile all that information and produce a risk matrix, and each site is ranked, and then based on that ranking they will organize the inspection regime. So that worked really well. And the last one, this is going now to the scale of the country, the national scale, is around the information that is produced by the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. We talked about establishing the discipline of water accounting back in 2005, 2006, and ABS has embraced this, and they are the ones who are responsible now for producing national water accounts. And to do this, they obviously collect water-related information from everybody, every single sector, economic sector. They send a survey to collect that information, and water is part of an environmental indicators survey. It's a yearly survey, so 2 years is a simple version of the survey, and the third year is going to be a lot longer survey. So a lot of information every 3 years, a bit less information the other years. It is compulsory, so everybody has to do it. You receive it in the mail. You have to do your environmental indicators survey. And what we found, the questions, that survey targets everybody in Australia. So the questions were not quite aligned to what mines use. So there was a process of engagement with that team responsible for the indicators survey, and we sat down and presented the water accounting framework. This is what we do. And then we just rearranged a lot of definitions so that they would better align with the water accounting framework. So the idea is that if you define it better with words the mines can understand, you will get better data. So they did what they could. You've got to be flexible there because the definitions have to apply to everybody, so you can't make it too mining specific, but rearrange a few definitions to align it better and to ensure people provided the correct numbers. So the more accurate the definition, then obviously the better the information you're going to collect, and then strengthens confidence into the ABS data that is produced. So they did modify the survey questions. How much it's impacting on the numbers, it's hard to tell because there's a bit of a delay between the engagement with ABS, which was back in 2016, and the accounts that are published now. There's a delay. We can only get the 2017, 2018 accounts at the moment on their website. So we might see slight improvement in data over the years just through that improvement in definitions. But mining, one of the things they report is what they call distributed water, which for mining is that input of water from third parties. It's quite tiny, as you can see, compared to agriculture. So yes, we might improve the data, but it's still so small compared to the rest of the Australian water accounts that it might not be a significant impact. But still, it's much easier for mines now to fill out those environmental indicators survey because they understand the questions much better. So it's much easier for them to provide the right information. So, and also saves time on doing that survey because you already have your water accounts. It takes 5 minutes to do the survey now, so much better. The public perception, there is still a lot of talk around water use in mining, and then these sort of articles get published. This one was published earlier this year in The Conversation. I get a little bit cranky when I read articles like this. They do not reflect any of what I've talked about. So the effort in producing a water account, the companies embracing it, the companies producing global water account, each mine producing a water account, mines submitting data to the regulators. So when you look at articles like this, they make it sound like there's no processes, there's nothing in Australia, you can do whatever you want. There's no mention of the water resource planning process, no mention of the ABS data collection process, nothing. It's like, oh yeah, the coal mines do whatever they want, which is not a good reflection of reality. So that paper, talks about water use, and I said how you know, it's ill-defined. What are you talking about here? Are you talking about input? Are you talking about output? What is it that we referring to? It's not explained. Lack of transparency, well, no. The ABS survey is compulsory. So there is transparency. You've got no choice but submit that data. The lack of consistent and available data, I don't think so. Everybody's producing water accounts, so much so that the regulator could establish a risk assessment framework because the data was so consistent. So this is not correct. Water use, I don't think there's gaps in water use reporting, and we might define what water use is before we make comments about it. So very disappointed with the public discourse around water use in mining, and I'd really like that term to disappear. Now, what did we learn? We're still learning about what we learned through the implementation. Groundwater is an issue. So the reporting of the groundwater input is tricky. It is quite hard to measure or calculate. The process that is used is calculation, back calculation, and it gets a bit messy, particularly at mines that have both open cut and underground operations that get really messy. And there's new regulation now for the reporting of associated water, which is a part of that groundwater input. So the framework has been really, really useful. It's been super, actually I could have added a discussion about this. When DSO was developing that framework around the regulation of associated water, it went straight back to the water accounts to have that conversation because they were really on the wrong pathway. And it's when we produce the water accounts, say, okay, I understand now, we need to look at it that way. So that could have been a part of the discussion, I forgot. So there are complexities around groundwater and the reporting of groundwater. Again, paralysis analysis is probably not super material. There are small volumes in the Bowen Basin, so do what you can, do the best you can. We understand it's not super accurate. We haven't quite cracked that one. We learned a lot about the behavior of water in spoil piles, and particularly the delays in that water to migrate back to storage. So that's why we're saying monthly is probably the best time frame, because it takes a while for that water to make its way to storage, a couple of weeks. But because of this, we've actually submitted a proposal to ECHA for 2021 funding. It's about detecting water table in spoil piles, because there are a lot of issues around not really understanding the behaviour of water in those spoil piles. So Menso and Draki from CMLR, in collaboration with Thierry Bor from the UQ School of Civil Engineering, they're looking at very exciting techniques to do that piece of work. So that's going to be a bit of fun happening in the next couple of years, hopefully. The biggest change, the biggest piece of work to produce those water accounts is actually to get the inventories. And at the large mines that cover a lot of kilometres and a lot of pits, it takes forever to get all those water inventories. It's a lot of work. So a lot of mines are experimenting with remote sensing of that water, trying to use tools to get an idea of water inventory remotely, rather than having to go to every single pit to measure the water level, because really that's the time consuming element. So there's a few activities in that space. Just to conclude, the requests for data from mine sites, they can be overwhelming. So they are always under a lot of pressure to produce information. Any project that's happening at a mine site, someone will ask for data, someone will ask for information. At the moment, we're doing a piece of work on post-mining land use in the Moranbah region with Anglo-American, Peabody and BHP. And we're asking for information, of course, and the data collection form is that big, and there's 2 or 3 guys at each mine just going around providing that information. It's going to take them days. I feel bad about this. It can be really overwhelming. So the water accounts did deliver some improvements, some of the data collection process, and it does save time. Every time someone asks something about water, here's my water accounts. It takes 5 minutes, so it does save a bit of time. And it has reduced some of the workload from the many data requests, so that's good. I think the elements that really contributed to the success is that system approach, that high-level description of water balance. It is critical, and every now and then we work with a mine that doesn't have this, and that's the first thing we do, and just start with this. Otherwise you can't see the wood for the tree, so you really need that. There's been fantastic collaboration between industry partners, really, sharing, what are you doing? How are you doing this? Can you show me? How about this one? It's been really good. And then that collaboration was the basis for all the engagement with the regulators and external bodies. There's been a coherent approach for the whole of the industry, and that's what's produced all the benefits. But engagement and consultation are critical to achieving the benefits. So the technical piece of work, easy, we can do that, 5 minutes. But the rest is what requires a lot of time involvement. So that's it, the Bowen Basin and water accounts. Thank you.
Claire, thank you very much. I'd like to open the session now to questions from the participants. If you could put your questions into the Q&A session for Claire, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, Claire, I think everybody's busy typing in some questions for you, and I suppose I was just, maybe while we're waiting for those questions to come through, you meant in the beginning we spoke about your implementation of the accounting framework at Anglo-American coal operations. Do you have any insights into some of the other regions, for example, Chile or Africa, and how they've gone about implementing it?
For Anglo specifically, or the other companies?
No, just in general. I was just thinking other regions.
I think they just follow the same process of engagement with their mine sites and providing guidance. So the workshops that the MC organised were really well attended. So I think that was a big help. And different companies use different time frames. So BHP, they went straight out for it. So we actually were contracted by BHP back in 2008, whenever it was, to help all their mines globally to do it. So they asked us to help out. And they were the first ones to do it. And there was not much reluctance. People were quite happy. And the biggest feedback we were getting at the time is, thank God, we're going to stop talking about water reuse. I can't stand it. So people were just happy to get back to, what matters, the water balance, rather than those side conversations about water use and water reuse that everybody found quite frustrating because we're meaningless. They said, oh, great, I can do this. I can do my water balance. That's easy. I can relate to it. I've got the numbers. I think that part of the challenge is, but I don't have enough data. I don't have all the data. And it's about starting. Get it started. You'll have blanks. You'll know where the unknowns are, and you can worry about that later. But just get that process started, and then you'll identify where the main gaps are, and then you can start investing in filling out those gaps. Now, Rio and Glencore, what they did, I'm pretty sure, and I hope I'm not going out of line here, but I'm pretty sure what they did, they used the experience in Australia to influence the other countries. Say, listen, we've done this in Australia, we had heaps of benefits, it's been great, not a lot of work, off you go. And I think that's the process they used. All
right, so a couple of questions have come through. First one is, who do you tend to collaborate with outside of UQ for groundwater modelling projects?
Well, so Flinders University, swimming specifically at the moment, we have projects with Flinders universities, but a lot of the time is consultants. So groundwater modelling there's a large skill set in the consulting firms. So very, very often consultants have a lot of people. They have a lot of software, they have a lot of computers, they have a lot of software licenses, they have a lot of experience, they already have the model most of the time. So a company will contract a consulting firm to do the groundwater model, and then they will ask us to provide feedback, to do a high-level review, to do a third-party independent review, and then we provide some feedback on that. And we've got our ways I've got nice little ways now that I can pull apart a groundwater. They tend to hide behind the complexities of their software, but I've got ways to go around this, so I can do that piece of work.
All right, I'll move on to the next one. Do you know if there's something like the water accounting framework for other industries? And could it be adapted to other industries?
So it could easily be adapted. The question is, do you need a high-level water balance? And I think that's where the conversation should be. Some mines will not benefit from the water accounting framework because it's quite simple. And you've got one dam, one pit, and not much water coming in. Your high-level water balance. You don't need to go through the whole process to find out. So it's not going to help you that much. Where it's super beneficial is when you've got a really complex mine site water system, and that's where we see the benefits. Not only a large mine site water system, but variable climates as well. So that's the benefits. So say a mine in Canada where they divert all the water and collect hardly anything, it's not going to be super useful either. So the degree of usefulness of your water account will very much depend on your mine water system and the complexities associated with it. So by default, in another industry, it's going to be the same. If you've got, I don't know, a manufacturing process and you open the tap for 2 hours every day and that's all you do, well, you understand your water balance. You don't need a water accounting framework for that. So I think it really depends on the level of complexities. But I don't think, so the ABS produces water accounts for agriculture, for instance, is almost all around the input of high quality water. They don't really produce anything else. There'll be some estimation of evaporation, but that's all there is in agriculture. You bring the water in, and then it evapotranspirates, and that's about it. So they don't have issues around tailings or that sort of things. Mine water management is a lot more complex than any other industry, I think, because they manage catchment, they manage tailings, they manage a range of legal issues. So it is a lot more complex.
All right, Claire, the next one I think is a really interesting question. How does the water accounting framework consider water quality issues? So examples of companies reporting on the quality as well as the quantity.
Yeah. So the inputs I report about water quality, and we ended up with 3 categories: high quality, high cost, high quality, low cost, low quality, low cost. So that's one aspect. And then the outputs is about water quality as well. And you do report the release to the receiving environment. So that's your first indication that there might be or might not be an impact on the receiving environment. So there's a decision tree, those three categories of water quality. There's a decision tree associated with it. So it goes, what is your electrical conductivity? Is it greater than 5,000, less than 5,000? Yes, no. And then you keep going through the decision tree and it looks at every contaminant, EC, turbidity, sediments, toxicants, metals, etc. So it is part of the guidance material that is produced, the user guides that I was showing. Now, ICMM is doing a lot of work around implementation of the framework, and they have slightly different views on water quality, and they're trying to simplify it and only have two categories. It's not a lot of work to go 1, 2, 3, and the decision tree is very helpful. So I'm not quite sure what they think 2 is better than 3, but anyway, I quite like, to me, 1, 2, 3, high value, high cost, high value, low cost, low value, low cost. I think it captures all of it.
All right. The next question, I think, builds on that, and it's really just getting into the granularity. So does the water balance model include changes in water quality between storage facilities as a result of both naturally occurring processes and operational decisions? And how is this regulated?
So the water accounting framework doesn't look at water quality in storage. It's your detailed site water balance model that does that. So remember, the water account supports the model, not the other way around. So it's in the site water balance model that they do that. And we are doing a lot of work. It needs work, the prediction of water quality, the assumptions they use for the runoff quality or the operational input are very high level and quite coarse. And we have a range of research projects, Menstor, Edraki, that's a lot of the work is around better prediction of water quality in the site water balance model.
All right. Okay. Are you aware of any sites where the water accounting process incentivizes the mine manager to try to improve the water retention of the land above or around them, e.g. by supporting natural vegetation cover or recovery?
It's provided incentives for better diversion, absolutely. And when they did the number after the floods, oh, yep. So definitely diversion. Now, not the techniques for diversion, though, haven't been influenced. So there's a recognition they need to do more diversion, but the way they do diversion is the way they've always done it. I don't think it's changed. Now, having said this, in Queensland, there are very, very good guidelines for water diversions. They were produced through ECAP research projects, and it's all published. It's very good guidelines, and of course they include all the geomorphology and the vegetation, etc. So there's been no change to this because the scientific work has been done, but it's helped highlight when you did require a bit more diversion.
All right. Claire, we've come to the end of the questions that are online. And I'm just giving everybody a warning. I'm probably going to wrap up now. So if there are any burning questions, please put them into the Q&A box quickly, because I'm about to say thank you to Claire for the presentation. So Claire, thank you very much for stepping in and doing today's seminar. I realized your entire team is out on site delivering work. So you got the short straw to give this week's seminar, and you've done it at the last minute. So thank you very much for coming and chatting to us about the water accounting framework. And I personally found it incredibly useful in my previous roles where I had to take an overview of water across an organization. So thank you very much to yourself and the team for doing that seminal work. Next week, the webinar will be delivered by Professor Daniel Franks. Daniel is the program leader of the Governance and Leadership Research Program within the SMI, and his presentation is titled Reclaiming the Neglected Minerals of Development. We look forward to seeing you next week. And if you've missed any of the webinars, they are available online and they can be found on the SMI website. And it just therefore leaves me to say thank you very much for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week for Daniel's talk. And thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you.